Hi, I'm Rashonda Cade. This is Reading with Rashonda. We are reading Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. We are on the third installment of Chapter 15, which will not be anywhere near the final installment of Chapter 15. As I told you, it is a mega chapter. So I'm going to overlap, excuse me, just a little bit that we read last time, and then I'm going to press on. Oh, as you can see, I'm standing someplace different. It doesn't hurt to try some. Well, I'm standing, which, good for my health. But it doesn't hurt to try someplace new. I'm literally in the same area of the house, but just a little bit of a different angle, a little bit of different lighting. We'll see if we like it. Never mind, Lizzie, she said. Anything to raise the wind. One might as well be killed for a sheep as a lamb. This latter expression was a favorite one of hers, she meaning by it that if one must be punished for an act, such as theft, for instance, that the punishment would be no more severe if a sheep were taken instead of a lamb. Mr. Brady exhibited the letters quite freely, but the parties to whom they were shown refused to make any advances. Meanwhile, our stay at the Union Place Hotel excited so much curiosity that a sudden movement was rendered expedient to avoid discovery. We sent the large trunks to 609 Broadway, packed the smaller ones, paid our bills at the hotel, and one morning hastily departed for the country, where we remained 3 days. The movement was successful. The keen-eyed reporters for the daily papers were thrown off the scent, and when we returned to the city, we took rooms at the Brandreth House, where Mrs. Lincoln registered as Mrs. Morris. Mrs. Morris reminds me of Gouverneur Morris. He was one of the writers of the Declaration of Independence. My high school history teacher seemed to like him a lot, which is why I know about Gouverneur Morris. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So Mrs. Lincoln registered as Mrs. Morris. I had desired her to go to the Metropolitan Hotel and confide in the proprietors, as the Misters Leland had always been very kind to her, treating her with distinguished courtesy whenever she was their guest. But this she refused to do. Several days passed, and Messrs. Brady and Keyes were forced to acknowledge that their scheme was a failure. The letters had been shown to various parties, but everyone declined to act. Aside from a few dresses sold at small prices to second-hand dealers, Mrs. Lincoln's wardrobe was still in her possession. Her visit to New York had proved disastrous, and she was goaded into more desperate measures. Who did the goading? This was a disaster. She's been lying. To me, it's out of control, but I guess we're going to press on and see what happens. Money she must have, and to obtain it, she proposed to play a bolder game. She gave Mr. Brady permission to place her wardrobe on exhibition for sale and authorized him to publish the letters in The World. The World is italicized like it's a newspaper. After coming to this determination, she packed her trunks to return to Chicago. I accompanied her to the depot and told her goodbye on the very morning that the letters appeared in The World. Mrs. Lincoln wrote me the incidents of the journey, and the letter describes the story more graphically than I could hope to do. I suppress many passages as they are of too confidential a nature to be given to the public. So next is her letter from Mrs. Lincoln, and I'm wondering if, like, the dresses being on display and letters displayed in The World harken back to what we read at the very beginning of this book, when Mrs. Keckley was like, Mrs. Lincoln put herself out there, and in so doing put me out there too. So I'm going to clear up any foolishness that might be afoot. All right. So the letter is dated Chicago, October 6th. My dear Lizzie, my ink is like myself and my spirits failing, so I write you today with a pencil. I had a solitary ride to this place, as you may imagine, varied by one or two amusing incidents. I found, after you left me, I could not continue in the car in which you left me, owing to every seat's berth being engaged. So, being simple Mrs. Clark, I had to eat humble pie in a car less commodious. My thoughts were too much with my dry goods and interests at 609 Broadway to care much for my surroundings, as uncomfortable as they were. In front of me sat a middle-aged, gray-haired, respectable-looking gentleman who, for the whole morning, had the page of The World before him which contained my letters and business concerns. About 4 hours before arriving at Chicago, a consequential-looking man of formidable size seated himself by him, and it appears they were entirely unknown to each other. The well-fed looking individual opened a conversation with the man who had read the world so attentively, and the conversation soon grew warm and earnest. The war and its devastation engaged. No, that is correct. The war and its devastation engaged them. The bluffy individual, doubtless a Republican who had pocketed his many thousands, spoke of the widows of the land made so by the war. My reading man remarked to him, "Are you aware that Mrs. Lincoln is in indigent circumstances and has to sell her clothing and jewelry to gain means to make life more endurable?" The well-conditioned man replied, "I do not blame her for selling her clothing if she wishes it. I suppose when sold, she will convert the proceeds into 5/20s to enable her to have means to be buried." Wow. She's only going to get 5/20s and then she'll just die and use that to be buried. I mean, it's not like mean, but it's ungenerous. Mm. The world man turned towards him with a searching glance and replied with the haughtiest manner, "That woman is not dead yet." The discomfited individual looked down, never spoke another word, and in half an hour left his seat and did not return. I give you word for word as the conversation occurred. May it be found through the execution of my friends, Messrs. Brady and Keyes, that that woman is not yet dead, and being alive, she speaketh and gaineth valuable hearers. Such is life. Those who have been injured, how gladly the injurer would consign them to Mother Earth and forgetfulness. Hoping I should not be recognized at Fort Wayne, I thought I would get out at dinner for a cup of tea. Then it has 3 asterisks, which I assume is indicating that information has been omitted, which is fine. We knew we were getting a redacted version, but then it just starts in the middle of a sentence. "Will show you what a creature of fate I am, as miserable as it sometimes is. I went into the dining room alone and was ushered up to the table where, at its head, sat a very elegant looking gentleman, at his side a middle aged lady. My black veil was doubled over my face. I had taken my seat next to him, he at the head of the table, I at his left hand. I immediately felt a pair of eyes gazing at me. I looked him full in the face, and the glance was earnestly returned. I sipped my water and said, 'Mr. S., is this indeed you?' His face was as pale as the tablecloth. We entered into conversation, when I asked him how long since he had left Chicago. He replied, 2 weeks since. He said, 'How strange you should be on the train and I not know it.' As soon as I could escape from the table, I did so by saying, 'I must secure a cup of tea for a lady friend with me who has a headache.'" All the lies, all the lies. I had scarcely returned to the car when he entered it with a cup of tea borne by his own aristocratic hand. I was a good deal annoyed by seeing him, and he was so agitated that he spilled half of the cup over my elegantly gloved hands. And elegantly gloved is italicized. I guess he's pointing out I had on my good gloves in this opportunity, and he got tea all on my good gloves. Dag nabbit. He looked very sad, and I fancied 609 Broadway occupied his thoughts. I apologized for the absent lady who wished the cup by saying that, in my absence, she had slipped out for it. His heart was in his eyes, notwithstanding my veiled face. Pity for me, I fear, has something to do with all this. I never saw his manner so gentle and sad. This was nearly evening, and I did not see him again as he returned to the lady who was his sister-in-law from the East. Then we have another break where stuff has been redacted, but we start at the beginning of a sentence, so how fantastic. What evil spirit possessed me to go out and get that cup of tea? When he left me, woman-like, I tossed the cup of tea out of the window and tucked my head down and shed bitter tears. She tossed the cup of tea out of the window? What in the world? What good does that do? Except for make a mess that somebody who's not her is going to have to clean up. More ellipses. At the depot, my darling little Taddy was waiting for me, and his voice never sounded so sweet. More ellipses. My dear Lizzie, do visit Mr. Brady each morning at 9 o'clock and urge them all you can. Okay, look, ma'am, you left New York. You did a bunch of stuff Mrs. Keckley did not agree with. You left New York. You went to Chicago on your own. I hope Mrs. Keckley went back to some place that she has run a business and started her business back up. But you're like, no, you must talk to Mr. Brady in New York every morning at 9 o'clock and urge them to sell my stuff. She is. Oh my goodness. I am fed up with Mrs. Lincoln by this point. Okay, I've been fed up with her, but like at every turn, ma'am, who do you think you are? Bossing around our friend Mrs. Keckley. I'm sorry. I will keep reading. My dear Lizzie, do visit Mr. Brady each morning at 9 o'clock and urge them all you can. I see by the paper Stewart has returned. Tomorrow I will send the invoice of goods, which please to not give up. How much I miss you, tongue cannot tell. Forget my fright and nervousness of the evening before. Of course, you were as innocent as a child in all you did. I consider you my best living friend, and I am struggling to be enabled some day to repay you. Write me often as you promised. Always truly yours, M.L. Like, you are my best living friend. I've had better friends than you, but they're all dead. So now I'm stuck with you. Mrs. Lincoln. All right. So this letter is over, and now we have Mrs. Keckley writing again. It is not necessary for me to dwell upon the public history of Mrs. Lincoln's unfortunate venture. The question has been discussed in all the newspapers of the land, and these discussions are so recent that it would be useless to introduce them in these pages, even if I had an inclination to do so. That's interesting. So this was very much written and intended to be read at the time that it was written. Like now, a couple hundred years later, or oh my gosh, like 250 years later, I would love to know what the talk of the town would be, but I guess I'll have to look through some microfiche to see that, and I don't know if I'm that interested in it. All right, the following from the New York Evening Press. The following from the New York Evening Express briefly tells the story. The attraction for the ladies and the curious and speculative of the other sex in this city just now is the grand exposition of Lincoln dresses at the office of Mr. Brady on Broadway, a few doors south of Houston Street. The publicity given to the articles on exhibition and for sale has excited the public curiosity, and hundreds of people, principally women with considerable leisure moments at disposal, daily throng the rooms of Mr. Brady and give himself and his shopwoman more to do than either bargained for. When a lady with face concealed with a veil called and arranged for the sale of the superabundant clothing of a distinguished and titled but nameless lady. 25 dresses, folded or tossed about by frequent examinations, lie exposed upon a closed piano. Why are they on a piano? I guess you put stuff where you can put it. Lie exposed upon a closed piano and upon a lounge. Stalls rich and rare, displayed upon the backs of chairs, but the more exacting obtain a better view and closer inspection by the lady attendant, throwing them occasionally upon her shoulders, just to oblige, so that their appearance on promenade might be seen and admired. Furs, laces, and jewelry are in a glass case, but the $4,000 in gold point outfit is kept in a pasteboard box and only shown on special request. Are they charging a fee for admitting people to this? Like, you could totally charge to get admitted into this, because all of these people are not buying things and like just free spectacle. I feel like people should be getting paid just to go in. The feeling of the majority of visitors is adverse to the course Mrs. Lincoln has thought proper to pursue, and the criticisms are as severe as the cavillings are persistent at the quality of some of the dresses. I have no idea what cavillings mean. These latter are labeled at Mrs. Lincoln's own estimate, and prices range from $25 to $75, about 50% less, about 50% less than cost. Some of them, if not worn long, have been worn much. Dang, they're like, who does she think she is putting her clothes up for sale? Oh, that's so gauche. Meanwhile, if you need some money, you sell what you have. I'm not mad at that. I'm mad at the deception and such, but I'm not mad that she's selling her clothes. And now they're talking about the state of the clothes. Forget all y'all. Some of them, if not worn long, have been worn much. They are jagged under the arms and at the bottom of the skirt. Stains are on the lining, and other objections present themselves to those who oscillate between the dresses and dollars, notwithstanding they have been worn by Madam Lincoln, as a lady who looked from behind a pair of gold spectacles remarked. Other dresses, however, have scarcely been worn, one perhaps while Mrs. Lincoln sat for her picture, and from one the basting threads had not yet been removed. Basting is like a temporary hem in something, so that hadn't even been removed yet. The general testimony is that the wearing apparel is high priced, and some of the examiners say that the cost figures must have been put on by the dressmakers, or if such was not the case, that gold was $250 when they were purchased and is now but $140, so that a dress for which $150 was paid at the rate of high figures cannot be called cheap at half that sum after it has been worn considerable and perhaps passed out of fashion. Oh man, they're like their stuff is worn down and it's passe. Mm. The peculiarity of the dresses is that most of them are cut low necked, a taste which some ladies attribute to Mrs. Lincoln's appreciation of her own bust. I mean, it's important to know what your assets are and dress for those assets. Well, I don't know if it is important to know what your assets are. Whether or not it's important to dress for those assets is different, but like dress for what looks good on you, not for what everybody is gonna love about you. Like this top I have on right now, I like it. I think it looks cute on me. It's not for everybody. Anyway, on Saturday last, an offer was made for all the dresses. Ooh, well, that's cool. I bet they wanted a real low price. Let's keep reading. On Saturday last, an offer was made for all the dresses. The figure named was less than the aggregate estimate placed on them. Mr. Brady, however, having no discretionary power, he declined to close the bargain, but notified Mrs. Lincoln by mail. Of course, as yet, no reply has been received. Mrs. L. desires that the auction should be deferred to the 31st of the present month, and efforts made to dispose of the articles at private sale up to that time. A Mrs. C. called on Mr. Brady this morning and examined minutely each shawl. Before leaving, the lady said that at the time when there was a hesitancy about the president issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, she sent to Mrs. Lincoln an Ashes of Rose shawl, which was manufactured in China, forwarded to France, and then to Mrs. C. in New York. The shawl, the lady remarked, was a very handsome one, and should it come into the hands of Mr. Brady to be sold, would like to be made aware of the fact so as to obtain possession again. Mr. Brady promised to acquaint the Ashes of Rose donor if the prized article should be among the 2 trunks of goods now on the way from Chicago. So all of that right there was the newspaper article. And now we're back to Mrs. Keckley. So many erroneous reports were circulated that I made a correct statement to one of the editors of the New York Evening News. The article, based upon the memoranda furnished by me, appeared in the News of October 12, 1867. I reproduce a portion of it in this connection. So now we're reading the part from the News, which goes on for several pages. Gracious. I don't feel like reading that right now, so we are going to stop. We will read that next time. We are reading Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. I'm Rashonda Cade, and this is Reading with Rashonda. Until next time.